Hey, it's Neil with Western Canadian Rockwell, and today I want to cover replacing 2.5-ton pinion bearings. So these are basically the two pinion bearings that support the pinion shaft that drive your 2.5-ton differential. These are a pretty common failure item on the 2.5-ton differentials. What happens is they use a separate oil bath from the entire differential, so they are prone to failure, especially if they're run at high speeds, or if they're susceptible to contamination like dirt or water. So what I want to do is go over how to shim these things properly, how to get them set up properly so that you get the most amount of life out of your new bearings once you get them replaced, and a few other little tips and tricks that come along with it. And the one thing I want to mention just to start off this video is that what we're not going to do in this specific video is rebuild the entire differential. So in your 2.5-ton differential, you have your pinion bearings that hold your pinion shaft. You've also got your ring gear that you can see here. We'll get a different view of this so you can see it better shortly. And it has a bearing that supports it, and then two more bearings back here that support the other half of it. And then you've also got your bowl gear, which is supported by two bearings as well. And the only bearings we're really going to cover here are these two pinion bearings, and we will get into a little bit of shimming on the crown gear. And the reason for that is because once you get into rebuilding an entire differential, there's a lot of work that goes into replacing all these bearings, re-shimming everything, and getting it all set up correctly. So this is more designed for more of the weekend warriors, off-road guys that you notice a bunch of play in your pinion shaft, you don't want to keep running it that way, but you also don't have the time to go through and replace all these bearings and shim everything because say you have an event next weekend or something like that. So all you want to do is just get this one issue addressed and then kind of carry on. And the other thing is too, is that once you get into replacing all the bearings in these differentials, things get really expensive really quick. So for a lot of, weekend warrior, mud truck guys, it's not really what you're looking to do. You'd rather just, replace the two pinion bearings, continue on with life, or find a whole new differential. So in this video, we're not going to discuss rebuilding the whole thing. All we're going to do is basically discuss, like I said, the pinion bearings and how to set them up properly, just so it can kind of get you back off road, get you running again. If you're putting this differential in an on-road vehicle that you're, taking on a 3,000-mile expedition, this video probably isn't for you. This is more for, off-road specific guys that don't put on a whole lot of miles and just want to get things running. And this is to help you get the most out of that amount of labor, basically. So if you want to completely rebuild it, what I would recommend is get yourself a manual. We got these on our website. Paperback. It goes over every single step necessary in order to rebuild these differentials. So if that's what you want to do, grab a manual. Possibly in the future I'll do a video on rebuilding these entire things, but for now, like I said, we're just doing pinion bearings. So follow along. So to start off, this is what your 2.5-ton differential is going to look like. I have two yokes because they're all designed to use in a tandem application. Drive shaft is going to come in on one side, and if it's used in a tandem truck still, you'll have a drive shaft coming out the other side. You've got your bearing retainers here, there and there, top cover, side cover. So basically to disassemble these things is you've got a big nut here, pull the cotter pin, it's an 1.5 inch socket, bust that loose, take the washer out, take the yoke off. Sometimes these can be stuck on, so you might have to use a puller to get them out of there. Once both your yokes are off, you can pull your top cover. You can also pull your side cover if you want to reseal it. You don't necessarily have to. Once that's done, pull your bearing retainers off. There will be shims in between the retainer and the housing, so be certain to save them. Wrap a piece of wire, zip tie around them, and then mark where they came from. And then once your retainers are off, there'll be a race behind each retainer. Give it a little wiggle, the race will come out, and you can slide the shaft out with the gear attached and the bearing cones themselves attached. Okay, so one thing to note when you pull your bearing retainers off of here. There will be shims, and what I like to do is keep track of those shims. Make sure you use a little scraper or something to get every single shim off, because sometimes they can be stuck onto the housing or they can be stuck onto the retainer. Once you got every single shim off, mark them. So you're going to have a big bearing. You can see that the one side is a lot bigger than the other side, the hole inside. Same thing with your retainers. This is where the races for the bearings sit. So small side, big side. Pretty tough to get them mixed up. So what I do is I just mark it. Small bearing, big bearing. And then at least you have a set of shims to start with. So once you're done that, get your housing all cleaned up. Get your bearing retainers all cleaned up. Clean up the pinion shaft and gear. Inspect the ring gear for any chips or damaged teeth. Same thing with the pinion gear. Make sure it's not damaged or cracked or anything missing from there. Once you're done that, you can use a bearing splitter, pull the bearings off of the pinion shaft, and give it an inspection as well. Once it's ready to go, now we'll start the assembly process. Okay, one more thing I was going to mention before I do start assembling this is that I just want to reiterate what's sort of involved with rebuilding this intermediate shaft in these 2.5 ton differentials. First of all, in here, in this part, this is one separate piece you can see here, and this is another separate piece, and then it's the entire housing, and there's shims in between these two spots. And what they do is, the shims in this first spot, basically what they do is they move the entire ring gear in and out from the pinion gear. And basically what this does is it affects your contact pattern on the ring and pinion. So if you're setting up your contact pattern, this is what you're going to have to move. This second set of shims here, basically what that does is it sets the preload on the two tapered bearings inside of here, so it gives you a little bit of resistance in those bearings. In this section here, there is another bearing, but it's just a strict, straight roller bearing, so there's no preload on that. Basically, it just holds everything in place, and the preload is all done inside these two tapered bearings. So with that being said, to get into these two tapered bearings, first of all, what you have to do is you have to press this crown gear off. So if you want to tangle with this part of it, you're going to have at least, like I've done it with a 50-ton press. I don't know if you can do it with anything smaller than that, but just be aware that you're going to need a pretty hefty hydraulic press to get this gear off of there. This plate comes off easily. It's just 6 bolts. It falls off. Shims are in it. The second plate, there's 2 pusher bolts, and you have to push this whole section off with the bearings off the shaft, and it can be kind of a bugger sometimes, especially if it's seen some contamination or water and it's kind of locked in there. So it can be real trouble. And then once you start messing with the contact pattern between the ring and pinion, it can take a lot of time to get that set properly, because every time you make a single adjustment in this set of gears, this whole assembly has to be pushed off and pushed back on again. So just be aware of that, is if you want to get into this, be prepared to spend some time doing it, especially if you want to make sure it's done right. Going forward with what we're doing, what I like to do is with this intermediate shaft is I like to have a little bit of preload on this ring gear, on these bearings. So a lot of times, once these things are worn in, you can basically just spin this crown gear just by hand. Just give it a little flick and it'll roll away on its own. And the problem with that is a lot of guys complain about the noise of these 2.5 ton differentials. And the reason that I've come to understand for that is because on a normal, like say Dana 60 ring and pinion, you have a ring gear and you have a pinion gear, and both of them are attached to something. So basically your pinion gear is attached to your drive shaft, which has, you know, some resistance because it's essentially attached to your engine or your transmission, and your crown gear is attached to your axle shafts, which is hooked to your wheels. So there's some sort of resistance in there. And what happens in this application is that this intermediate shaft and this ring gear isn't hooked to anything. It's just sitting here floating. There's nothing hooked to it. So if there's no resistance on this gear, what can happen is if you get into a deceleration situation where, you know, your engine isn't providing any sort of backload on this crown gear, what'll happen is this gear will sit there and it'll kind of float and it'll do this, you know, crazy chattering motion as it moves back and forth. So what I've found quietens these things down, and it's not a permanent fix. Like as your bearings break in and you lose your preload, it's going to get noisier and noisier and noisier. But if you want to quiet it down while you're in here, what you can do is pull this set of 6 bolts. Don't disturb this set of shims in there. Try not to disturb anything except for this set. Remove this off, clean everything up really good, and simply remove one small shim, like say a 2.5 or a 3 thou shim. Tighten this back up so that if you could, you know, simply give this a little push and the ring gear spins, put a little preload back in it. And this differential, it was dropped off by a customer, and I think it was pretty new. I don't think there was much wrong with it. They just wanted a locker installed and new pinions bearings put in it because it's a whole fresh build. But as I pulled this apart, the crown gear does have some resistance in it, which is basically what you want. And if you want to get right into it, I'll pull up the manual here. So this is the correct way to check the preload on the bearings in this intermediate shaft. And you can see here the outer plate shims, inner plate shims, and then here are your tapered bearings that all sit inside this piece. And what you want to do is basically use kind of an old fish scale, wrap a set of wire around the crown gear, pull on it, get it spinning, and basically what you want to see is the proper measurement is between 2.4 and 7.1 pounds of bearing preload. So you can do that in this step. If you're using used bearings, like obviously you haven't changed these tapered bearings, you're going to want to go on the low end of this scale, so 2.4, somewhere in that range. New bearings, you're typically going to want to go into the higher end of that scale. So that's something to mention while you're in here. It's just another easy step. It'll quiet things down, kind of make your differential a little more, you know, pleasant to drive, so it doesn't sound like a, you know, blender full of rocks when you let off the gas. And if you've drove 2.5 tons, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I just wanted to mention that, get a little preload in here, get this set up. If you don't have a fish scale, you just have to be careful you don't put too much preload in here, because if you get over that 7-pound spec, tapered bearings are very susceptible to too much preload, and what it'll do is it'll overheat them and burn them out. So if you don't have a fish scale and you don't know, you know, how much preload is good and how much is bad, then be cautious with that. Just maybe put a little tiny bit of preload in it, and that's it. So the next thing you want to do is get yourself some bearings. And a note I want to make on bearings is that, unfortunately, with the influx of overseas parts, a bearing is no longer a bearing. Just because it has the same part number doesn't mean that it falls under the same quality control standards that every other bearing does. So you want to get yourself something that's a reputable name. So, you know, NTN, Bauer, Timken, Koyo, all those bearings all fall under a certain quality standard. They have to meet that, and that involves the size of the bearing, the fitment, the hardness of the bearing, all those important things that come along with bearings. If you end up getting a bearing off of Amazon or something that has some no-name brand that, you know, you can barely pronounce, there's a good chance that it doesn't meet those quality standards. And there's a reason why it's, you know, a third of the price of the comparable NTN bearing. And I've seen these things. They're not that great a quality. So if you don't believe me, try it, run the cheaper bearings. but make sure to bookmark this video because you're going to be back here doing this again in the near future. All the bearings that we sell on our website are a brand name NTN or Timken, just because we like to provide the most amount of value and the best quality parts that we can find. So with that being said, if you need pinion bearings, give us a call. We'll be happy to set you up, keep them in stock so you can have them, you know, within a couple days. So the way I like to do it is heat your bearings up. I have a bearing heater, which is handy, but you don't necessarily have to have one. You can, you know, throw them in a little easy bake oven or something, or use a little propane torch to warm up the outside. Don't get them too hot. Usually around 350 to 400 degrees is about as hot as you're going to want to go. If this bearing starts to change color, if it gets blue or, you know, unfortunately red, then this bearing ain't going to be good anymore. You're going to pull the temper out of it and it's pretty much garbage. So usually what I'll do is on the bearing heater, it's easy to watch because there's no open flames, but once it starts smoking a little bit, that's usually when it's around that 350 degrees, somewhere in that range. So I just watch it. Once you can see a little bit of kind of steam or smoke rolling off of it, I call it good, and it works pretty good. And I'll show you how I set the shaft up in the vise next. Okay, so I set the shaft up in the vise vertically. You can see it's all nice and frosty because I let it sit in the freezer overnight and get nice and cold. You can hear the bearing is still warming in the background. I'll go grab it shortly and we'll throw it on. There we go, it's bottomed right out. Nice and flat the way it should. You can see the steam coming off of it from the frost. I'm gonna let that sit for a couple minutes so it shrinks onto the fit, can't go anywhere. And I'll flip it over and I'll put the small side on. Watch the frost melt right out of it. That is installed. Okay, here's our pinion shaft with both bearings installed. They're still a little warm, but not hot enough they can hurt me. The shaft slides in from the big side like this. And then the next thing you want to do is get yourself a shim kit. We sell these as well. They come with basically all the shims you need for in here and your pinion bearings as well. And I'll show you what that looks like. And what you want to do is take your old shim kit, measure out each one. You can measure the stack, but I don't like doing that because as you can see there's a bunch of dirt and grit and all that kind of stuff in there. So you don't want that taken into account with your measurements. So just find a clean spot, measure each individual shim, and then rebuild this pack with a new set of shims. If you're, you know, really hurting for money and you can't afford the few bucks it is for a shim kit, you can reuse these, but you have to clean them up really good. Like I said, there's a bunch of dirt and crud, and usually if you pry them off of the housings, they get kind of bent up and stuff. So you really have to clean them up, shine them up, make them look real good, and then you can reuse them. But I would recommend just grabbing a shim kit. So. Okay, so here's a shim kit that we sell. If you're looking to purchase one of these off our website, the part number to look up is 252652. And how it's laid out is you have, so these are one set of shims. You can see that they're slightly different from these. These ones with the big hole here, these are your pinion bearing shims. These ones with the two small holes, or sorry, two medium holes and one small hole, these are for your intermediate shaft. Like I said, I don't have to adjust anything in this intermediate shaft. Like I don't have to re-shim the preload on the bearings. So I'm not going to require any of these. So what I'm going to do is just set them aside. But what I will need are these pinion shims. Now what, like I said before, is just simply measure these ones out as well, rebuild your existing shim pack, and install your bearing retainers, and then we'll go from there. Unfortunately, this differential that I got from the customer, it was already completely disassembled and I didn't get any pinion shims with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just basically going to take a shot in the dark. I'm going to start with a few more pinion shims on the big bearing side and a few on the small bearing side, because that's typically how I've seen them, and then go from there. And one thing to mention is when I install these bearing retainers, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to gun them up with an impact. I'm going to tighten them up by hand, and as I'm tightening them by hand, I'm going to check to make sure that the shaft is still loose, because the last thing you want to do is have too few pinion shims on either side, especially the big bearing side, and then ram that pinion gear into the crown gear and possibly damage something. So just use a ratchet, go slow, go by hand. Like I said, just feel to make sure that there's still a little preload and tightness, or preload and wiggle in the shaft. And then once you get everything tight, we'll go to the next step. So I've broken my shim packs into two separate pieces. Here's the big bearing, here's the small bearing. So what I'll do is I'll start installing these. As I noted earlier, there is a small bearing and a big bearing retainer, and this is to fit the races. So obviously this is the race for the small bearing. It fits inside that little pilot. There is no difference between the shim packs. They're the same for the small and the big. The only thing you have to watch out for is there is this oil drain hole, and it lines up with the shim packs. So when you're installing it, make sure that that stays lined up. The holes aren't symmetrical, so I don't think that it's possible to get them mixed up. It's just something to note to make your life easier as you start putting it together. Get the shims set up. This. Throw a bolt in there just to hold everything in place. Okay, so I've got both my bearing retainers started here. I'm just going to use 2 bolts just to draw them up. I'm not going to bother putting all 6 bolts in either side because I don't know if I'm going to have to pull shims out or not. And then, like I said, I'm just going to draw this in nice and slow and check to make sure there's still movement in the shaft as I do so. I'm going to start with the big bearing end, and then I'm going to move on to the small bearing end. Okay, so I've gotten to a point where I don't have, like, these are just barely snugged, but I've lost all my, I've lost my ability to turn the shaft. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to tighten these anymore. I'm going to leave it. What I'm going to do is check backlash here, and it doesn't look like there's any backlash available. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to move the pinion gear away from the crown gear, which means adding a couple more shims into here. So what we're going to do is pull a shim from this side, from the small bearing side, move it into the big bearing side, shift everything this way, and then see what we get for preload. Or sorry, backlash, see what we get for backlash. Okay, it took me 5 or 6 times to get shims moved around properly in order to get the correct amount of backlash. So right now, could be a little tough to see, but I got my dial set up, and we are looking at about 12 thou. And in the manual, it says 5 to 15 thou is your tolerance. So we are well within that. So what we're going to do next is check our tooth contact pattern with a little bit of marking compound. So sometimes in order to get a good contact patch, you do have to provide a little bit of preload on the back side of the ring gear, which we'll do now. So you can see we are starting to get a little bit of a pattern developing. I will work this back and forth a little bit more to see if I can get a little deeper pattern, but you can see that it's starting to form. Everything's looking good here. So I don't think I'm going to mess with the backlash or anything else. I'm just going to work that pattern in. Like I said, check the coast side as well, and from there we should be okay. Okay, I'm not sure how easy this is going to be to see, but this is my pattern check on the coast side of the gear. You can see that it's a little bit closer to the toe end, which is okay. You know, as a gear loads up, it's going to work its way to the outer end of the tooth. It's also centered within the middle of the tooth, so it's not too far out on the land, and it's not too deep either, so I'm happy with that. The drive side of the gear, it's the same. I don't know if you can see it from in there, but same thing. It's more centered in the tooth and, you know, between the toe and the heel, but it's also centered between the outer and the inner part of the gear tooth as well. So I'm happy with that. One thing I should mention is that if you're messing with these used differentials, is that sometimes it can be a real bugger to get a nice pattern check on a used set of gear teeth, especially if they weren't set up properly to begin with. If they were set up improperly and then run in that way, they're going to be a real bugger to get a nice pattern check. Usually what I recommend, and this is just my personal opinion, so take it as you will, is if the drive side of the gear is giving you a real wonky, hard to read pattern check, like say for example, I'm going to use the coast side of the gear here, but on the drive side, if the pattern check sort of runs out the end of the tooth and then sort of comes back in, it's sort of an indication that this tooth has been set up improperly and then run in that way. So what I'll do is go off of the coast side of the gear, because it hasn't seen as much wear as the drive side, and see if you can get a good pattern check there. And if you can, then just leave the drive side for what it is. Let it kind of wear in that direction. If you can't get a good pattern check on either side, then, you know, unfortunately it's up to you what you want to do. You might have to buy a new ring and pinion or try a different differential. What I can say is, again, this is entirely up to you, but as long as your backlash is within spec, you're probably okay to try running this thing. But again, that's up to you. If you're a perfectionist and want this set up perfectly, then I would highly recommend replacing both the ring and pinion in order to get that good pattern check. But most importantly, if you're not a perfectionist and you're just trying to get your mud truck running for the weekend, focus on the backlash, make sure it's within that 5 to 15 thousandths of an inch, and you should be pretty good for a decent amount of time. If you go too tight on the backlash, what that's going to do is it can cause a lot of heat to build up, because as the gears get warm and expand, there might not be enough backlash in there, so they will be in full contact the whole time, not really allowing oil in between the gear teeth. And if you go too much, it could be really noisy, could cause a lot of shock loading, that sort of thing. And also running too much or too little backlash is really going to mess up that pattern. So you could be, you know, way out on the outside of the gear tooth or way too far in. It's a good possibility if your backlash isn't correct. Okay, so here's another really important part. I mentioned earlier that, you know, a lot of guys that I've seen, they have a lot of pinion bearing failures. You know, I've seen guys saying that they're replacing pinion bearings like every 2 to 3 rides, which if you're running a clean oil, you're not running water or dirt through these things, doesn't really make sense. There could be a couple factors. Obviously, I talked earlier about low quality bearings. That could have a part of it. Contamination. So if you do fill this thing right full of mud and you don't clean everything out and there's still a whole bunch of mud packed in here, even if you add new oil, that mud's still going to get it into all the pinion bearings and wreck the new ones. So make sure you clean everything out really good if it does get full of contamination. And the other thing that I want to mention, which is quite important, especially if you're at this stage of the process, is pinion bearing preload. So tapered roller bearings are very susceptible to too much preload. If you load them too hard, they will heat up and fail quickly. So there's a very, very fine balancing act between that. You can run too much, but if you run too much or too little preload, sorry, what's going to happen is the shaft will be able to float back and forth. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause all sorts of problems with your ring and pinion. So you don't want too much and you don't want too little. So with that being said, this is where you run into the issue. The proper way to check the pinion bearing preload is to remove the crown gear. Like I said, that requires pressing the shaft out, pulling all this apart, pulling the gear off, and then doing the same thing that I mentioned earlier, is wrap a piece of wire around it with a fish scale and lift up on the piece of wire, turning the shaft, and check the load on the bearing preload. That's, I understand, not really feasible for a lot of people, especially if you're just doing pinion bearings and these bearings are in perfectly good condition. So this is what I'm going to recommend, just from a personal standpoint. Take it for however you want. Like I said, if you're a perfectionist, by all means, pop this crown gear out of here, tear all this apart, grab a manual, reassemble it exactly as it's supposed to be. If you're just trying to get your stuff running for a weekend event, then what I recommend doing is put a little bit of preload within these bearings, but do it by feel. So the way that I done it is, you can see there is some backlash. So I've got my 12 thou backlash that I mentioned earlier, and I can feel that in order to get that 12 thou backlash, it does take a little tiny bit of force in order to get that shaft to move back and forth. If there is no preload, I can literally do it with 2 fingers. I can move it back and forth with 2 fingers. This one I can't. So if I just grab onto the shaft like this, I can still move it, but it does take some, there is some resistance there for sure. And I'm good with that. Where I wouldn't be good with it if there's too much preload is this is going to take a lot of force. Like, it's going to take, you know, a good amount of effort to get that shaft to move. That's too much. You're probably going to overheat these bearings in here. So like I said, make sure that there's a little bit, so you can't just turn it with 2 fingers, but make sure there isn't too much that the shaft is extremely difficult to spin. Just make sure it's got a little bit of resistance in there, and you should be good. When you are checking the resistance, make sure that you put a little bit of oil on your bearings. These ones I've given a squirt in and out. You never want to check any bearing preload or any tolerance or nothing like that with a dry bearing. It's always good to put a little bit of oil on them. And so with that being said, I'm happy with this. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to pull these bearing retainers back off, install the seals, and install the rest of the bolts, bolt it back up, torque everything. These are 1/2-inch bolts, so I just go off a basic bolt torque, which I believe is 65 foot-pounds. Torque them down. I like to coat everything in here with a good bit of oil, put my covers back on, and then once that's done, I'll roll it over, reinstall the bull gear, any lockers and stuff like that. I'm not going to go into that in this video. We do have another video that goes into those details, so if you want to check it out, it is available on our channel as well. Okay, a couple things I was going to go over about pinion seals. I do cover this in a few other videos, but it's relevant here as well, because basically one of the main things protecting your pinion bearings from contamination, dirt, mud, and water is your pinion seals. So if you can keep your pinion seals in good condition, it's going to help your pinion bearings last a lot longer as well. So what I do is install the pinion seal. You can see there's a lip inside here. Drive the seal so it sits up against that lip. Once it's bottomed out, that's where it's designed to go. Over the years, these retainers can get pretty beat up. They can get rust and stuff built up inside of them. Also, if guys are changing pinion seals and get aggressive with a chisel or a hammer, they can gouge out the surface where the seal sits on. And what that can do is it can cause oil to leak out past the outside of the seal, or contamination to get in from the outside of the seal. What I like to do is, if it is gouged out, run a little bit of sealant around the outside of the seal, press it in, it'll fill up any of those little nicks or dings so that it's a perfectly good seal on the outside of it. The other thing to mention is a lot of off-road buggies and mud trucks and stuff like that, they will run a pinion brake. So basically it's a rotor and a brake assembly mounted right off the pinion, and essentially you have a smoldering hot rotor no more than a couple inches away from this pinion seal. And if you run a typical rubber seal, what's going to happen is it's going to get smoking hot. The rubber doesn't like heat, so it's going to get hard, it's going to get brittle, it's eventually going to break down and fail, which is going to allow contamination into your pinion bearings, piling them up, and then basically we're starting from scratch again here. So if we can solve that problem, what we've done, what we offer now, and we have for a few years, is a high temperature oil seal. So what this does is it'll handle, 400 to 500 degrees for extended periods of time. So if you're running this high temperature seal next to a pinion brake rotor, it's going to last way longer than the typical rubber seal, and it won't break down, it won't burn up, and it won't fail like the rubber one will, obviously preventing any contamination from getting inside of your bearings. What I typically do, because these seals are a little bit more than the rubber seals, is I only install them on the pinion brake side. I don't feel the necessity to install an expensive seal on both sides, so I only ever really install these on the pinion brake side. These are available on our website as well. If you're searching, part number is 255979 with the letter U. Okay, so pattern is checked, bearings are set up, I've got my retainers torqued up. The next step is to install your yokes. So it's just your yoke. There's a heavy flat washer and a nut, crown nut that goes on there. So there's a cotter pin that fits through that. The one thing to mention is the small bearing side. So opposite of the pinion gear, there is a spacer that goes in behind the yoke, and it's only on the small bearing side. This one is actually broken, so we're going to replace this. Basically slides in there, it will fit in between the seal. So you slide that in, slide your yoke on, washer fits on. It's always good to put a little bit of sealant behind the washer because there's nothing to prevent oil from coming down these splines and leaking out past the washer. So I always put a little silicone on there. Put your nut on, torque that down. The torque spec is 300 to 600 foot-pounds. The reason for the broad range is obviously because you have to turn the pinion nut to get your cotter pin lined up. So somewhere between 300 to 600 foot-pounds, so basically tight is what they're saying. A couple notes that I've been asked is that the yoke does not change any preload or anything like that. It's not like a Dana 60 where the yoke is pushing on a bearing or anything. It basically just bottoms out against a shoulder on the shaft. So the only thing that sets preload and everything is the bearing retainers. All the yoke does is just bottoms out, tightens it up, that's it. The other thing too is that when you are torquing these retainers down, the shims will crush some. So it is possible that as you're tightening it down, that you might run out of preload, like you might have too much preload. So what you have to do is add an extra shim in here on the small bearing side. Don't change anything on the large bearing side. And you don't need to run any sealant behind these shims. They will crush and seal. Okay, that's about it. That wraps up our 2.5 ton pinion bearing install. Obviously you can just install your covers again. We do sell gaskets for these if you want. Silicone does work as well. Other than that, follow these steps. You should get pretty decent life out of your pinion bearings. Obviously make sure to run good clean oil. If it does get contaminated with water, change it out. I would also recommend pulling the covers and wiping out inside here because it is a separate cavity to get all that water and contamination and stuff out of there. But if you do that, you should get good life out of these pinion bearings. I just want to say thanks again for tuning in. Appreciate all the support and the comments we get from our videos. If you can, do us a favor, like and subscribe to our channel. And every time we put out a new video, you'll be the first one to get notified on it. And if you do need parts for any of these 2.5 ton, 5 ton Meritor Axletech axles, we carry a large selection of replacement parts and aftermarket upgrade parts as well. So if you need anything, drop us a line, give us a call, send us an email. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Thank you very much.